right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our 11th Annual Financial Executive Forum. And I want to thank everyone for joining us again today. This is the second event in our 2025 webinar series, and we really appreciate you joining us this morning. My name is Grant Palmer, and I'm a partner with Cordia Resources by Cherry Beckert, one of the sponsors for this series. As you'll see, we also have 4 other great sponsors who I'll introduce shortly. I also want to thank and acknowledge Sage and Aaron Harris for the great program last week on how AI is transforming accounting, obviously a very hot topic in today's workplace. Our sponsors are excited to see such a great response with over 1,300 people registered for this series. We know and understand how valuable these high quality and relevant training events are to financial professionals managing corporate accounting and financial functions. Once again, we're providing this series in a fully virtual format and are running it in 2-hour sessions every Thursday morning over a 6-week period of time. We found that this format works best for our collective clients and friends. Today, we're joined by the Cherry Beckert team, who will be presenting CMMC Demystified and the GovCon CFO's Compliance Challenge. You should also know that we have a great team from Cherry Beckert running our virtual program today, but please bear with us should there be any technical issues. As you can see, we have 6 great programs for you in this year's series. If you fully attend all 6 events in your CPA, you can earn up to 12 full CPE hours. Our series includes the following. Last week, as I mentioned, we had Sage, a returning FEF sponsor, presenting how AI is transforming accounting. Today, as noted earlier, the Cherry Beckert team will present CMMC Demystified in the GovCon CFO's Compliance Challenge. On October 16th, next week, Jennifer Lewis will once again join us as our ethics instructor from the AICPA's Business Learning Institute, and will teach our Virginia Ethics program, the 2-hour courses required by the Virginia Board of Accountancy. On October 23rd, Marsh McLennan, a returning sponsor to the FEF, will present Fiduciary Risk, Responsibility and Opportunity, Implications for Health and Retirement. On October 30th, the Wells Fargo banking team, a longtime friend and sponsor of the FEF, will present their economic update and Let's Get Digital Banking Automation with APIs and Embedded Finance. And finally, on November 6th, the Cordia Resources by Cherry Beckert team will feature our CFO Roundtable, which will once again include an impressive group of CFOs. Next slide, please. Before we move forward, just following up on the video you saw at the outset of the event this morning, in terms of NASBA compliance, our polling questions will appear throughout the webinar. You will need to answer 75% of the 8 polling questions to receive full CPE credit for each session. Any answer to a polling question, correct or incorrect, counts towards the 75%. Since you'll be muted during the entire session, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions to the panelists. Please use the chat feature to communicate any technical issues. After the program, please complete the session survey using the link that we'll send to you in the post-event email. Your CPE certificate should be issued within 10 days of this course. If you have any questions, please reach out to Cherry Beckert Learning at cbhlearning@cbh.com. Next slide. Now I'd like to acknowledge our great team of sponsors for the entire 2025 Financial Executive Forum series. Our first sponsor is Marsh McLennan Agency, a leading provider of business insurance, employee health benefits, retirement, and private client insurance to organizations and individuals. Marsh is a returning sponsor this year and is represented by Allie Gregory, an employee health and benefits consultant. Next is Wells Fargo Bank. Wells Fargo, a well-known national bank, is represented by Executive Director Ben Kane. Wells Fargo Commercial Banking is a returning and longtime sponsor of the Financial Executive Forum. Our next sponsor is Cordia Resources by Cherry Beckert, a leader in recruiting and staffing services in accounting and finance, technology, HR, contracts, and administrative support services, and is represented by Doug Smith, one of our key managing directors who leads our sales and staffing services team at Cordia Resources. Fourth is Sage, a leader in finance, HR, and payroll software. Also, Sage's digital networks connect SMBs, reduces friction, and delivers insights by digitizing business process. Sage is also a returning sponsor this year and is represented by Gary Marr, Senior Channel Executive at Sage. Our fifth and final sponsor is Cherry Beckert, a top 25 nationally ranked accounting firm specializing in tax, audit, outsourced accounting, advisory, and system services, who is represented by Tracy Sheps, a CPA and a partner at Cherry Beckert. Next slide, please. And this is today's agenda. Very busy, very full agenda today. Well, actually, Leah Gearhart will be closing us out at the end this morning. So next slide. Now I'd like to introduce Tracy Shepp, Steve Ursillo, and Brigitte Scott, all partners with Cherry Beckert. Steve will present CMMC Demystified, followed by Tracy and Brigitte, who will present the GovCon CFO's Compliance Challenge. So with that, Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Grant. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to CMMC Demystified. Certainly excited to be here today to guide you through the presentation and take you through some of the latest onsets of what's happening in the CMMC world. Just make sure that I can actually move these slides forward here. So bear with me. There we go. Okay, so today the plan is to cover much about the onset of CMMC, how it's evolved, and where it stands. But before we do that, just give you a little bit of a brief intro on myself. Steve Ursillo, partner here at Cherry Beckert, as Grant had alluded to earlier. One of the leaders in the information assurance and cybersecurity practice. Been with the firm about 8.5 years, and our group gets involved in an array of different types of information assurance and cybersecurity services. So CMMC, SOC reporting, high trust. A lot of what you'd expect for third-party risk and compliance. We also have a cyber advisory practice where we help folks build out, design, execute, and evaluate their cybersecurity risk management programs, from governance, risk, and compliance down to technical execution, offensive security, incident response, so on and so forth, for purposes of helping organizations mature those programs. And in addition to that, we also get involved in some managed services as well. So just to give you some of the background as far as where we operate and how this kind of all falls into everything. So ultimately, as we step through this presentation today, we're going to go through CMMC requirements and get everybody up to speed on really what the program has to offer, some of the benefits and where it's evolved. We're going to recognize some of the elements of what it would take to kind of go through that program. And we'll talk a little bit about some challenges, pain points, and other areas that really have been, I'll just say, troublesome for some organizations. This just really kind of talks about our overall approach to cybersecurity. I just kind of talked a little bit about what we all did as a practice and within our group. And then we're getting right into why CMMC is important. So there's no question that our threat landscape continues to evolve as it pertains to cybersecurity. The sophistication, the nature of technology, the way in which we operate in the cloud and with third-party providers makes it a pretty lucrative target for many adversaries out there, whether it's China, Russia, other types of nation state and or organized crime channels, in order to try to extract and steal information for either competitive advantage or any type of espionage. So with that, there's been an increased amount of attention in the regulatory space as it pertains to what's expected to tighten up the safeguards in order to make sure not just government contracting, but all organizations are putting their best foot forward to make sure that they're defending and appropriately protecting data to adhere to both contractual and regulatory requirements. In many cases, obviously, when it comes to the Department of Defense or Department of War, it's critical that we protect certain controlled technical information and other controlled unclassified information to maintain our advantage as it pertains to safeguarding our nation. There have been incidents that have taken place where Chinese state-sponsored threat actors have targeted U.S. defense contractors and have stolen unclassified information, controlled unclassified information, and controlled technical information. There was a specific example of the theft of a information and plans related to the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. It was traced back to a contractor intrusion back earlier in the time, where the breach did expose some key elements of how in which that fighter plan was orchestrated. So this highlights the importance of why it's so critical to defend not only, some of the critical elements of our sensitive information, but also as we start to go down the supply chain and we start to talk about all the different folks within the supply chain getting that information for whatever part of the contracts that they need to fulfill, and making sure that that's protected and safeguarded to the level that it needs to be. So in many cases over time, what we found is that the protection clauses around controlled unclassified information originated pretty early back to the implementation of DFAR 7012, and I'll kind of get through that timeline. But over time, making sure that organizations have put forth the right assessments to make sure that there's consistency along the landscape has really been a critical factor. So why is this so important? We want to make sure that we're securing and safeguarding information. We're protecting our contractual obligations and our fiduciary obligations in order to safeguard that information. And we're making sure that both our and any of our downstream providers or primes and subs are consistently fulfilling the obligations as it pertains to making sure that that information stays safeguarded. This includes any type of cloud service provider or external service provider, or anybody providing any types of logistics or anything like that. So it really does apply all the way down from primes down to subs. Right now, the CMMC model in and of itself, it's evolved over time. I'm just going to go ahead and give everybody an opportunity to answer their polling question. CMMC has evolved over time. It originated probably about, I'll say about 5 years ago in the first Trump administration, and it's continued to evolve over, the last 5 years or so. With that, there's been changes in the different levels and expectations as far as how the program has been facilitated. But right now, as it stands, we have level 1, which is really the model, the base model for protecting federal contract information. And federal contract information, as you probably are well aware, really includes contract information, proposals, maybe system descriptions or architectures, meeting minutes, internal communications, things like that. For level 1, there's basically a self-assessment that's expected. So folks will go through the baseline questions as predicated based on the FAR, and then they will go back and assess a basic level of security. That's what's expected for level 1. You'll see based on the diagram here that it's FCI, not critical to national security. Annual self-assessments would be part of those requirements. When you get to level 2, you're starting to talk about really controlled unclassified information. And it's bifurcated into 2 different elements here. You have a non-prioritized acquisition, and then you have prioritized. A vast, substantial majority of those are going to be prioritized acquisitions. So there's going to be much more in the way of certification requirements versus any type of self-assessment only. Now, folks are still going to be required to put their self-assessments into SPURS every year as part of those clauses. But again, every 3 years, there'll be an expectation for those that are needing certification to be able to go through and actually have those audits performed, those CMMC audits performed. So those audits are going to cover 110 requirements from NIST 800-171 Rev 2. Which translates to about 320 control objectives as well. Very prescriptive on what's covered there. And then ultimately, we're going to get into where we get into level 3. There's going to be a small population of prioritized contracts, the highest priority programs that are going to require level 3. Level 3 is really led by Department of War, DoD. That's going to come in after the C3PO has done the level 2 assessment. And there's about a number of maybe 24 requirements that are going to be part of NIST 800-172 for a more mature-based cybersecurity initiative, right? So really you're getting into advanced threats, advanced threat management, and some more advanced types of tactics in order to mitigate some of those threats. So it covers everything that you would expect. These are all cumulative. So for example, level 2 is going to cover everything in level 1, and level 3 is going to cover everything in level 2 and level 1. But really where it comes down to the differentiators is, once again, level 1 self-assessment, Level 2, for the most part, is going to be certification. And then level 3 is going to be certification by a C3PAO, which is an organization that is authorized to conduct these audits like Cherry Beckert. And then you're going to have level 3, which is, again, once an organization goes through their level 2, the Department of Defense will come in and do the delta between level 3 and level 2 to provide certification at level 3. It's government-led. All right, so that's pretty much the makeup of the program as it stands. The program, like I said, took some iterations, but it's been a fairly long journey, and I'll get in. Just advance this slide here. Got a little bit of a delay, so certainly apologies there. When you look at the compliance timeline, it really falls back to once again, the implementation of DFAR 7012, which is around 2016. And was expected to be implemented around 2017. Folks were doing assessments based on NIST 800-171. What happened over time is that there was a maturity in that process, that people started submitting their scores into SPURS. This way, those that were in the supply chain could evaluate folks' compliance scores and have a central repository for being able to look at that. Over time, and this is part of the real key reasons why we talked earlier about why CMMC is where it is, the scores were not consistently applied in many cases. So if an organization was compromised, and then after the fact, the forensics teams went in and found the root cause of the breach, and to the extent of what controls worked and which ones didn't, then they go back and they assess the level of the self-assessment that was put in by certain representation of the actual organization that was breached. They were noting discrepancies. They were noting significant discrepancies and misrepresentations, in some cases blatant misrepresentations, on the control structure of the organization, right? So over time, that's what forced kind of the deeper hold into, we need to hold folks accountable and have a standardization of this process, which led us to where we are present day for CMMC. So when we talk to people about these requirements, we do like to iterate that these have been around, pretty much since 2017, when there was an expectation for DFAR 7012. It's just a deeper level of understanding and a more consistent approach to how you apply those controls. So lo and behold, when you look at the timeline, CFR 48 is really the rule that wrapped up the CMMC program. That was put into release August 15th. It actually became finally effective December 16th of last year. So once again, this is CMMC program and the rule in and of itself, CFR 48. So over time, and I apologize, that's CFR 32. CFR 32 got a typo there. CFR 32 is actually the rule going into the register for the CMMC rule. CFR 48 is the acquisition rule, which I'm going to talk to next. So once January 2nd of this year actually came to fruition, many of the C3PAOs had to get recertified. So they were basically reassessed. They had already gone through their certifications. They had to get their DIBCAC assessments, but they had to make sure that any of the deltas in the change of CFR 32, that particular rule, were upheld by those C3PAOs. Once that took place, now certification started. So we've seen certifications go into effect this year. Our firm and many others have been very active in both readiness and certifications for different organizations. And then lo and behold, you've seen probably a lot of the news now for CFR 48, which is actually implementing CFR 32 into contracts. So as of November 10th, that's the effective date of CFR 48, which means that any new acquisitions coming in, sorry, slides are moving. Any new acquisitions coming in post November 10th of this year, there's going to be expectations to, if you're dealing with federal contract information or you're dealing with control and classified information, to be able to adhere to these standards, right? And ultimately what that's going to mean is that if you're operating on a legacy contract, you're going to continue to do your self-assessments, but then when new contracts come in for purposes of next year, you're going to be expected to start to follow the clauses of doing the particular timeline implementation of doing a self-assessment for CMMC in post November 10th, right? So the next slide throws a little bit of a timeline here to actually give you an idea of what that looks like. And again, I'm going to apologize because there seems to be a delay on these slides. There we go. Okay. So phase one is really after the CFR 48 drops post November 10th. You're going to start to see phase one, and that's going to be all folks that are store processing and transmitting CUI are going to be required to self-assess against the CMMC requirements and submit that score into SPURS. So they'll be following all the logistics and the all of what's expected in the CMMC program, and recording their score into SPURS for phase one. That's going to get them from, in essence, November 10th of this year through 2026. The second phase of that is going to be where folks are going to be expected to get certification. So we have folks right now that are ultimately going through the certification process. They're trying to get ahead of the timeline, knowing full and well that it is going to impact them. So this has been an initiative, and I encourage people all the time to say that I would not wait. It's certainly going to be a journey between your readiness process and then making sure you do your gap assessments, understand the nuances of the program, and then going into execution. So as of November 10th of 2026, there's going to be an expectation post that date that certifications are going to be the norm for folks that are store processing and transmitting CUI. Once again, there are certain situations, very, very limited, where there's an element of that will not require the certification, but for the most part, it's going to be certification. In addition, you're going to see phase three, and phase three is going to start to roll out the actual third level, that where folks, the elite folks or the folks that are dealing with those high prioritized contracts are going to need to have their certifications performed. And then phase four is going to be full implementation. So that's really what we're looking at as it pertains to the timeline. So when people start to ask questions now, it's usually the case where they're fine doing their self-assessments. Now, keep in mind, it's really important to note that the DoD contract officers have the ability to demand certification or request certification earlier, right? And we anticipate that folks will actually start to evaluate. We already see it now with some of our clients where they're asking questions as far as what's the timeline, when do they expect to be certified, and then starting to open up those communication channels. Some are trying to get certification sooner than later, even though the law does give you a year to be able to self-assess. They are trying to get those self-assessments and those certifications done more promptly to give them, number one, a competitive advantage, and two, make sure that it becomes less of an issue as they go through any contractual elements there upon award, to make sure that they can do what they need to do. So the next slide that I do have here is really a breakdown of what's expected based on the organizations and the size of the organization, or the size and what's required for certification here. There we go. Okay, so you'll see that the breakouts here show from level 1 self-assessment, level 2, and level 3, and the difference between the self-assessment and the certificate being that of the certification. What you'll find here is that a vast majority of this level 2s are going to be required for certification. That's what that certificate means. So in essence, you have 80,000, estimated to be 80,000 small entities, and then you have large entities at 37 for the total of 118. The level 1, once again, being the FCI self-assessment, and then you have the level 3, which is only 1% of the defense supply chain that is expected to be there. So it gives you kind of a real good understanding of the scale, the mere scale of what's happening here. Keep in mind that this is prime and sub. So any of the managed service providers or other types of providers that organizations using, this is certainly going to be something that is going to impact them. Overall, we typically will talk to organizations and say, if you're store processing and transmitting that controlled and classified information, you're going to be operating at that level 2. That's what you're going to be wanting to look for. If you've already have DFARS clauses in your contracts, and those are contracts that you know are going to be renewed, that's going to be something you need to consider. Those are going to be things that are going to come down the pipe. going forward with your certification requirements. There's a fair delay here. I'm not sure if our team is experiencing that. I want to leave something in the chat just to let me know how that's looking on the other end. So how do I know whether or not, what's the level that I'm going to be assessing at? In many cases, obviously, it's going to be predicated based on your contracts, whether or not you're a prime or a sub, whether or not there's specific provisions in there based on what's going to be the type of data and the type of information that you're processing. And then level 3 is just going to be a determination. Again, it's going to be driven by the contract. The federal contract officer can answer a lot of questions on behalf of folks that are looking at that. But when people ask us, in many cases, is this going to be applicable to us? We typically will defer to understanding what's the nature of the contract, what's the nature of the clauses, and talking to any contractors. Keep in mind, there are some, different types of challenges that come down as it pertains to the classification of controlled unclassified information. Typically, that's predicated based on the prime and the flow down. If there's any questions there, you'll typically circle back with those contract officers and just get validation there to make sure. This can be a pretty significant element of what you're looking at, mainly because of the fact that if your system is store processing and transmitting certain types of information, and as you go through and present your CUI documentation, you're going to start to find what systems it touches and how it interoperates. And with that being said, what happens there is that organizations will have to follow that map. And if you have information flowing into a certain subnet or a certain environment or a certain boundary of the network, you're going to find that you'll have to bring that into scope. So if that information is improperly classified, you may be bringing systems into scope that you don't want to. A big part of where we provide advisory services to our clients is really around understanding the flow of that CUI and understanding what systems are involved. And in certain cases, if they have the ability to restrict that traffic or have that traffic perform in what's called an enclave or a subset of their major production environment, then it can reduce the scope and the burden, which ultimately helps them drive compliance more effectively and also at a cheaper price and less resources. So the flow down requirements here, just as a way to kind of take a look at this, is really predicated on the type of data. We've mentioned this before. This is just kind of reiterating that. FCI and CUI. Level 1 self-assessment, FCI. CUI is going to be NA. Level 1 is kind of incorporated into level 2. When you go into level 2 self, that's going to be level 1 self-assessment, level 2 self-assessment. And then, of course, when you get into level 2 certification, you'll have level 1 self, but you'll have level 2, the C3PO, which is actually the audit. And then level 3 is going to bring level 1 self, and then the level 2 C3PO. In addition, it'll be the delta of those controls for the DoD or the Department of War actually doing the level 3 assessment there. So that kind of gives you a synopsis. When you talk about whether or not you're going to self-assess in level 2 versus actually doing the certification, this is a slide right here that kind of breaks out and says, anything related to defense is going to require certification. Anything related to non-defense, or I'll say, some of the other elements outside those categories could potentially be wrapped up in a self-assessment. But a vast majority, like I said, especially if you have those DFARS clauses, you're going to be driving in on the defense information, which is going to require that certification. Okay. The level 3 determination, again, higher priority. The Lockheed Martins of the world, the primes that are certainly categorized as it pertains to doing critical elements of the defense supply chain, information gathering and processing are going to be those that kind of fall into that mix. It's only about 2% of contractors, or 1%, I should say. Okay, so what does the certification process look like? This is a question that we typically navigate quite often. The certification assessment follows a process that's prescribed in what's called the CAP, which is a CMMC assessment process. This is followed by all C3POs. So it's available for folks to be able to take a look at. So the scoping guides and other elements of artifacts from the Cyber AB that allow organizations to truly understand the methodology and how to implement controls in order to safeguard and best navigate the DFARS clauses for 7012, 7021, which is a CMMC, and NIST 800-171. So the first part of this really comes down to the first phase, which is the pre-assessment. So from this process, once engaged with the C3PAO, the C3PAO will go through this initial phase where they will review a system security plan. The system security plan is designed to be very prescriptive around how you're actually operationalizing and meeting these requirements, and going specifically into all the elements of the 110, 320, 110 controls, 320 control objectives. So the first part of this assessment would be information gathering, looking at the system security plan, making sure that what you see in the system security plan is consistent with the methodology that is prescribed by CMMC. Also making sure that all the other document artifacts, such as your CUI flow diagrams, your network diagrams, your shared responsibility controls with any third-party provider like a cloud provider or a MSP, managed service provider, are followed consistently, and that it looks like that the organization has gone through a thorough process in getting ready for the assessment. So we would, in essence, from that perspective, validate the scope, make sure that asset classifications are appropriate, that the boundaries and the systems are included, that we are seeing mapped out within those diagrams. So if you're using a cloud provider, if you have data that's flowing, whether it's to remote printers or to a manufacturing operation or something like that, making sure that the boundaries of those operations are actually being pulled in intact. Then ultimately going through that readiness process and seeing whether or not there's any gaps based on the information provided. So not really any interviews other than just information gathering. And then once that's complete and the assessor feels that the organization is in a good place to go forward with the assessment, they would then submit a pre-assessment into EMAS. And at that point, we'd schedule interviews and start to conduct the assessment. So phase 2 of the assessment, you can see the timelines on the bottom. So depending on the nature of it, could be a couple of weeks on the first part of that. And then in the second part of it, when conducting the assessment, there'd be in-brief meetings. So typically the control owners and the assessment team would meet and go through each of the controls, each of the requirements, talk about the documentation as to whether or not there's elements there that are met or not met, and then ask for evidential matter, whether it's inspection, additional evidence, or just reviewing some of the technology in screen shares or over the shoulder of somebody to see that the technology is being executed as prescribed. There'd be sampling and scoring elements there where the testing would get a little bit more thorough as far as making sure that there's a comfort level for the design of those controls. There'd be looks and incorporations of the cloud service providers. So if they're using any type of cloud provider, such as like GCC High or GCC from Azure, AWS GovCloud, so on and so forth, then there'd be elements there of just reviewing how they're operating with those particular entities, looking at shared responsibilities, and then looking at their external service providers. So if they are using, an MSP or another third party that's out there helping them manage their security, those ESPs are required to participate in the assessment. So depending on the nature of what those service providers are doing, a lot of what they do and how they operate needs to be incorporated into the system security plan of the organization that's seeking the compliance. And then ultimately, that's part of the assessment, and they would be responsible for participating in the assessment as you go through that. That's mandated by CFR 32. There'll be daily checkpoints, ultimately going through where you are as it pertains to your audit. And then there's quality assurance reviews on the side of the C3PAO every time we actually go through the assessment to make sure that everything's prescribed and where it needs to be. And then once that's completed, there's typically a discussion on what items are outstanding and what's the recourse as far as are any of these in a position where they can be POAMable, the plan of action. Some of these requirements are mandated, where if you don't meet them, then in essence, you don't meet the mark for the assessment. You can't go forward. In other cases, some of the requirements are actually able to be POAMed, where you can put together a plan of action for remediation. You can get a conditional letter of certification, and you have 6 months to not only remediate, but have the assessor come back in and assess that to give you your final certification. So there is some flexibility there. That's all prescribed in CFR 32. So once phase 3 hits, we're compiling the results. We're doing the quality assurance review on the whole entire thing. There's 3 CCAs that are required to be part of the process. Those are certified assessors. Those CCAs are complied of. The engagement's composed of the lead CCA, an additional CCA, and then there's a quality CCA who basically takes a look at everything through the process and at the end, and ultimately has to concur on the position of the lead assessor. And then those results are finalized and uploaded into EMAS. And again, depending on the situation, there'll be a certificate that's produced based on the status, whether it's full compliance or whether or not it's conditional based on the remediation of those particular POAMs. And then there's a process and schedule by which the assessor will follow with the organization to assess those POAMs to give final compliance. And that's typically, again, a timeline could be a couple weeks after that, or depending on the nature of the reassessment, the organization's timeline for when they actually remediate, up to 6 months for completion on that whole process. So that's what the certification process looks like. Again, once every 3 years, needed for level 2 and above. So some of the things that we've seen for challenges and pain points, in many cases, like I said, organizations have been dealing with these requirements for quite some time, but CMMC has really put some teeth into the nuances as far as how to do things, how to scope things, how to classify assets, and really prescriptive on how to actually react to and extend controls based on the flow of that COE. And I think that was kind of one of the larger disconnects from some of the earlier self-assessments. And what we found is that, in our readiness processes, organizations that have self-assessed and hasn't really gone through a true readiness with folks that are familiar with the CMMC process, we find that the updated scoring is inconsistent from their prior scoring, which is expected because they haven't had the appropriate subject matter experts get in and evaluate based on the new prescriptive requirements of those standards. So it is something that we do see. I think that's kind of a gotcha for some folks because there's been an expectation that they were in full compliance and then they come out and have an assessor look at it. And basically before they submit their self-assessment scores, they come back and they see that there's a pretty material difference in the way in which they were scoring things. And that's something that they have to navigate. Some of the more tactical and technical elements of it really come down to some of the scoping. Once again, organizations trying to understand what is CUI based on the contract and what's prescribed by NARA, and ultimately making sure that they're clear on where CUI is stored, processed, and transmitted, carving the boundaries and making sure they understand the logical and physical segregation required in order to capture those boundaries. If you have controlled unclassified information flowing from, say, a cloud provider into a manufacturing facility, then that manufacturing facility is now brought into scope. If it's a flat network, not only the manufacturing area, but now the office area within there becomes brought into scope. So organizations are really reevaluating their architecture to see whether or not they can actually microsegment or separate that manufacturing environment or that CUI environment from the rest of the organization. Now, you can take an enterprise approach and certify the entire organization, again, at a cost, resources, and potentially something that's not necessarily needed if you have the ability to restrict some of that information. So a lot of the discussions really come down to what's your strategy? How much work do you do commercial? How much work do you do in defense space? And then does it make sense for you to do everything, or does it make sense to carve out certain elements of your operation to make sure that you're executing within the confines of those boundaries so that your certification can be brought narrowly across? It's not uncommon for organizations to try to do the level 1 across the entire organization. It's basic hygiene. It's something that's best practice to have anyway. And then ultimately assess whether or not they want to take the rest of the requirements, the 110, 320 from the NIST 171 across the entire organization and as an enterprise, or if they want to build it out based on an enclave. So definitely logical segregation and boundaries becomes an important factor. The other thing that we've typically seen is where organizations have tried to draw out particular boundaries where they have an enclave or a segmented piece of the network. They have laptops and users that are accessing those networks through VPNs or through web browsers. And ultimately, there was early interpretations of that where folks thought that that would be okay because it's obviously the client side access and they're putting restrictions there, with maybe with DLP, data leak protection, things like that, data loss protection. But ultimately, that's not always the case. So in time, there were further interpretations that said you would need a VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure, or Citrix, or something like that, where you're connecting to a virtual environment within the enclave in order to descope those laptops. So the laptop, in essence, if you're actually using a VDI and you're connecting into that environment and you're using a workspace in that environment and there's protections for the flow of CUI coming back to that laptop, then you can remove that laptop from the scope. If that laptop is connecting through a VPN or a browser or something like that, you're still store processing and transmitting information on that particular laptop. That can potentially bring those remote locations into scope, or you're constructing that laptop to be more like a mobile laptop where you have safeguards in there to protect it from connecting to any other network while it's connecting to that particular CUI environment, in addition to all the other endpoint controls that you'd expect to have there for anti-malware, data loss prevention, everything else that goes along with it. Those are a couple of gotchas that we typically see. Another big one is around ESPs and MSPs. Many organizations will use a managed service provider, and those managed service providers come in all forms. So either some managed service providers that are providing just remote hands to an organization's infrastructure that they own. In certain cases, those MSPs and MSSPs have their own tech stack that it includes their own technology in addition to maybe cloud technology, and they're deploying it out to the clients, right? And the client uses that, engages them, and they manage that. The use of the MSP is definitely constitutes an ESP, an external service provider, and there's particular rules, as we talked about earlier, with these external service providers where they have to participate in the audit, they have to have their own elements related to the system security plan translated into the client's organization. In addition, there's a shared responsibility that has to be documented. They have to participate in the audit. So it puts a lot of burden on the MSPs, which then drives many questions to the strategy of the MSP. I've seen some MSPs that are practicing in this area, but may only have a couple of clients, have decided to get out because they don't want to go through the burden of all of this. I've had others that have doubled down to say, yeah, it's an X percentage of our particular client base. But we see ourselves as a differentiator. We don't want to give it up. So we want to start to position ourselves in the market to go forward and do more of this. And they've actually gone through and done their own CMMC assessments and actually, like I said, making themselves a differentiator to push that to market. So there's different aspects of that there. There's been some of the latest interpretations and tractions there muddy the water a little bit, where if the MSP is basically has a turnkey offering for a client that involves, a hybrid approach to cloud and their own systems. And there's kind of this process where they're store processing and transmitting on behalf and controlling all the security and all of the operations behind the scenes. It gets a little muddy there where they could potentially be constituted as a cloud service provider, which means cloud service providers have to get FedRAMP and or a FedRAMP equivalency, which is certainly an undertaking. So I think in certain cases, the MSPs now are starting to grapple with, are we good the way we're structured in providing services, or are we starting to step on the boundary of being classified as a cloud service provider, which is going to up the ante for us in requiring us to actually go through that FedRAMP process or FedRAMP equivalency? That's another area where we've seen some challenges for some folks. We already talked about cloud service providers having to be FedRAMP, and we talked about some of the system security plans. Some of the challenges within those system security plans has been really around asset coverage, maybe incomplete coverage or misclassification of assets. They're not addressing all 320. You'd be surprised. We've seen organizations come back with only the 110 controls. They haven't really dove into those assessment objectives as it pertains to the 320 requirements. So there's a major gap there that has to be unpacked. In addition, there's specific terms and verbiage like defined, specified, identified. When you see that, that's a red flag to say, that needs to be documented, formally documented in your process and in your program, in your system security plan. If it's not, it's going to be a gap. So even if it's in the spirit of or implied, that's not going to get you where you need to be. So you have to be really, really cognizant of what's prescribed in those overall expectations in the standard in the assessment process to know what needs to be formally documented and what does not. Lacking detailed data flow and network boundary diagrams. If you can't display in a some type of visual or formal, I'll say formal format of how your data is flowing or what network boundaries and logical and physical segregations you have, that's also been a gating factor for some phase one part of the assessment. And then obviously any type of misclassification of access can also be a factor. Because once again, if you misclassify something as out of scope and it is something that should be in scope, then it can bring an entire network or a boundary into scope that you weren't thinking about. And then that cascades from there. So that's a particular tough element when organizations are going through that process and they miss that. A couple others, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, but really coming down to the labeling. So CUI labeling and identification, in many cases, that's going to be prescribed by the contract. And if there's questions, you go back to the contracting officer. It's the responsibility of the prime or the sub flow down, to make sure that that information is properly marked and classified. And in addition, if you're creating CUI, understanding what elements of how you're creating it differentiate something from being a commercial product to a CUI product. Because once again, as soon as it turns into a CUI product, now where is it stored, processed, and transmitted? How does that come into fruition as it pertains to the overall assessment process and the boundary? So sometimes there's a lack of guidance there. We have questions come back to us all the time. Is this CUI? We're typically leaning on the fact that you'd have to look back at your contract, look back, talk to the contracting officer. If it's not labeled, then go back and ask those questions. If you think that that information is improperly labeled, then, I would encourage you to go back and ask the questions to the contract officer to make sure. The last thing you want to do is maybe make some type of an assumption that something is CUI when it's not, and then you bring a whole element of your environment into scope and you spend a significant amount of time, energy, and effort to get that environment where it needs to be, and come to find out the information that you're actually acting upon is not even CUI. Maybe it's FCI, maybe it's not. So I think that that's something that you would want to be cognizant of. So I strongly recommend legal interpretation as well as looking at those contracts and talking to your contractors, your any type of contract program manager to help you with that, to specify the labels and the markings. And then if there's any dissemination elements there, that's also important. So if you have CUI that is restricted, ITAR, anything like that, that's going to require further protections. So there's certain environments that are conducive to that, like GCC high versus GCC, where now you can actually have no foreign data going into that environment. But again, you have to work on the boundaries. You got to make sure that everything is appropriately, logically, and physically segregated in order to make sure that those boundaries are intact. I should say logically or physically segregated. So that becomes another differentiator there when people are dealing with CUI. The question is what type of CUI, and is that going to mandate any change? We have seen organizations take a particular structure with a FedRAMP provider, or they've taken a particular structure with having an environment that they felt was good with CUI, but then lo and behold, they had no foreign, and that particular environment did not support elements of what's required for that classification of CUI. So some of the assessment tips that I would certainly want to highlight here based on what we covered. We talked about a lot of different things here, but ultimately making sure, excuse me, you identify CUI and you understand the business operations and the flow of that CUI. That's going to be critical. That's going to allow for you to really set the foundation of your assessment and making sure the boundaries are where they need to be. Then you're going to make sure that there's properly scoped and documented boundary alignment, and make sure that you're looking at those scoping guides. There's a level 1, level 2, level 3 scoping guides that are out there that you can get from the CyberAB that you can take a look at there. Then you can take a look at making sure that your SSP is complete and accurate. Attention to detail is paramount here. Just making sure that everything that you say in there is going to be in line with what's expected. If there's formal call outs to some of the verbiage, that you have it formally documented and that you're clear on how you're doing something. And then, of course, if you're doing something a certain way and your security protection plan says you're doing it another way, that's going to potentially present some challenges when it comes to the audit. You have to be consistent and be able to show documentation for how you're operating. Yeah, make sure your asset inventories are complete and they're properly categorized. Like I said, that's been something that's been a challenge, whether it's a out of scope asset, a CUI asset, a specialized asset, which is something that, could be, something received on behalf of testing equipment or anything like that. If it's IoT or anything of that nature, where you have to make some special circumstances there. If it's a contract risk managed asset, contract risk managed assets are in scope for all the requirements, but not necessarily going to be fully in scope for the assessment, other than just making sure that the assessor is clear on how you're actually, putting the controls into effect to protect those assets. But those are typically assets that are not intended to, but could access CUI. So all these different classifications provide different nuances, and it's important to understand that. Then, one of the real important things is definitely take the time to go through that mock assessment or gap assessment. Make sure that you have a few different interpretations as it pertains to if you're looking at it from internal resources. Are your internal resources subject matter experts? I've seen plenty of cybersecurity people that are very, very competent in the cybersecurity space, but they don't know the nuances of CMMC and have got themselves into trouble. So there's kind of a cross expectation there of cybersecurity experience, but deep experience around the CMMC requirements and the interpretations and the law as to how it stands for CFR 32 and how the program's being executed. So definitely make sure that when you're evaluating the folks coming in to do the readiness to help you, that they do have a strong background, not only in cyber, but also in understanding CMMC and the requirements around CMMC. We did talk about the assessment process, but I'm going to kind of take you through a little bit of the readiness process here. Typically, the readiness process is going to be where if an organization is looking to just establish whether it's for their own self-assessment, invalidating their self-assessment so they feel comfortable around the scores that they're going to be held accountable for, versus whether or not they're actually getting ready for the audit. Keep in mind that the DoD has definitely put in, teeth into holding people accountable. There's been false claims acts that have been put forth on organizations who have misrepresented their position as it pertains to the maturity of their scores. This is important in the fact that even if you're not required to have certification, if you were required just to self-assess, you do want to make sure that those self-assessments are accurate so that, heaven forbid, there's a breach. And then after the fact, they come back and say, well, you said you're using multi-factor authentication. You clearly weren't, or whatever controls broke down to not negate the or mitigate the breach that occurred. Then it comes back to false representations within your self-assessment and potentially liability there. So certainly encourage folks to go through a process to make sure that they are comfortable with even their self-assessment that they're putting in. Keep in mind your C3PAO or your assessor cannot help you with readiness. There's very strict ethics and independence requirements here. So for example, Cherry Becker, we can operate on both sides of the fence, but not for the same client. So we could go in and do readiness, be part of helping that team get ready and support them for the audit. Or we could come in to do the certification. But if we're doing the certification, we can't provide any advisory services. This is not just Cherry Becker's rule. This is the rules within CMMC for the relationship between an assessing organization and those that are providing readiness services. So they can't do both. Becomes a gating factor there. So once again, readiness is going to be key to the success, making sure that you've thoroughly gone through this process, you've thoroughly recognized what's required, you have all your documentation and your systems and your controls lined up for success is going to be important. So what does this look like? If you're either early in the process or maybe you're revisiting what it looks like, typically there would be discussions on just confirming where the organization is to try to understand the level of maturity that they have. So let's just look at that first step on the far left here where we have the readiness process. Let's determine and recognize, are you required to be level 1, level 2? Do you have a level 3 contract? Let's make sure that we're setting you up for success in what that readiness process looks like. We need to know what criteria, what requirements that you're up against? What are some of the contracts that you have? What's the type of CUI that you're going to be store processing and transmitting? Do you have regular CUI, no foreign CUI? What are the systems at which this is going to traverse on? How are you operating? What is your overall business strategy? All of that kind of comes into effect. And again, why do I say business strategy? Because maybe you're only doing 5% commercial and you're doing mostly government contracting, or the reciprocal of that. That may have a huge impact on how you address the technology to meet the certification, all right, and how much you invest to do that and what's your strategy overall. But through that process, once that's done, we meet with the engagement team, the key stakeholders, and go through kind of the overall determination of when do you need to be certified by? Are you in this self-assessment buffer? Because remember what we said, after November 10th of this year, CMMC is going to be expected for those for level 2 are going to be able to self-assess until November 11th of 2026. And then they're going to have to do their certifications unless the DoD has an override provision or the contractor forces certification. So we need to know what we're at stake here. Is it something that we're putting a certain timeline on? What are you communicating with these third parties? Are they coming back and saying, hey, we need you certified by June of next year, or we need you certified by X date? We need to know what that endpoint is so that we can back into it, knowing that there's going to be a timeline to go through and get the certification done, and potentially some remediation that the organization may need. So if that's the case, we want to set them up for success in that readiness process. So agreeing on a project management schedule, talking about any type of status updates. Usually there's reoccurring meetings that take place where, any questions, if the team does have some support where they're helping the readiness team gather information, or you got key IT and project management individuals that are gathering information and bringing it back and forth to the readiness assessor, just to make sure that they're given some direction, answering questions. It all depends on how involved the readiness teams gets. There may be readiness teams that are reviewing documentation, or it could be where the readiness team is helping prepare documentation, helping them complete the system security plan or do anything like that. So that becomes a strong part of that. And then ultimately, really talking about what are the communication touch points going to be going forward. Then we go into the scoping part of it, where we would document all the different requirements. We would look at all of the 110 controls and 320 control objectives across the entire population to make sure that the scope is sufficient and effectively determined to meet its compliance requirements. And then ultimately just making sure that we are keeping key stakeholders and executives involved in that process, so they know along the way as to anything significant that comes up or anything that needs to be pivoted. Unfortunately, I have seen situations where, organizations have gone from Azure Commercial to Azure GovCloud, or GCC High, I should say, just because of the nature of the fact that they recognize, hey, we need to do this because of the amount of no foreign CUI that we have, and it's just best for us to move over to that environment. That comes with a cost, that comes with a migration plan, everything else. So those are things that could potentially come in. So we go through that gap assessment process, and then there's the gap remediation process. So once we have kind of a list of items that need to be remediated and what type of remediation, is it a documentation? Is it a new strategy? Is it new technology? Ultimately, all of that kind of becomes a factor. And then ultimately, once the remediation plan is set, we go through the steps of remediating those, and then we get to a point where we're ready for that compliance assessment. Now, depending on the nature, sometimes in many cases, we have organizations that once we go through that process, they'll go through, make sure their I's are dotted and T's are crossed. Then they'll have us do a mock assessment where we'll come out and actually act like we're going through the audit, ask the questions, do everything that we need for the client in order to once again take a step back, give the client the feeling of going through the audit, what types of questions are going to come forth, and how they're going to prepare the documentation and what they're going to want to have to demonstrate based on interpretation there. And then once they have gone through that, they then will go forth and step into getting the assessment. A couple things to note there, just from a timeline perspective. We certainly encourage organizations to engage in both their readiness partner and the separate assessing group sooner than later. I can tell you from many perspectives, the C3POs have a backlog, sometimes 4 to 6 months, depending on the nature. You saw 80,000 contractors that are going to need this. And there's only a certain amount of assessors and assessor organizations out there. So there's, many of the organizations that are providing these services have a backlog. So don't wait to get out in front and getting those contracts signed. Just get on the schedule and then start to work towards a project plan there. So I know we went through quite a bit. I wanted to take us a few seconds here just to look through some questions
We're going to discuss government contractor CFOs compliance challenges, just some of the top ones that we see that we know are pretty important. I am Tracy Sheps. I'm partner and leader of the government contracting consulting and our ERP practice at Cherry Beckert. I have been with Cherry Beckert for almost 15 years, with a career in government contracting from industry, behind the desk, like most of you probably are, to helping clients and client service.
And I'm Brigitte Scott. I'm also a partner at Cherry Beckert. I lead the outsourced accounting services practice for government contractors. I've been with Cherry Beckert a little over 8 years, and my background's very similar to Tracy's. I've either been in industry or consulting or public accounting, but always serving government contractors.
Okay, we're going to start with the compliance framework for government contractors, which will help you understand the various levels of compliance that you must follow as government contractor. Then we'll go into the top 10 CFO compliance challenges, and we'll end with some best practices.
So compliance framework is what we're going to talk about next. So we have this kind of drawing here that shows kind of the evolution of what it takes to get to a compliant environment. So down on the left, it starts with the law. The law represented by what's in the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the DFARS, what's in the cost accounting standards, CFR, Code of Federal Regulation, other regulations or FAR supplements. I mentioned here the FTR or the DOE's supplement. Those are just examples. There's obviously a lot more there, but it's what's been promulgated into law. Moves up into guidance. So guidance would be things that come out from like DCAA or DCMA or other agencies' guidance and instructions. So they're not authoritative, meaning they're not law, but they're interpretations, they're the guidance or instructions on how to interpret the law in a lot of times layman's terms. They even give more color commentary. For instance, in the FAR, it doesn't tell you how to do total time accounting, but DCAA in the DCAM tells you exactly what you need to have in your timekeeping policy. Then to move up into a company framework, that's really where all the different organizations or departments within the company, and we've listed a number of them here, finance and accounting, HR, IT, legal, and so forth. It's where those policies and procedures are implemented to take the law and the guidance and interpret them into what makes sense for the company. These are important. I mentioned total time accounting, so a timekeeping policy could be a travel policy. It could be, how you handle procurements with, subcontractors or material buys, what you do with contracts, who can sign, pricing, what kind of rates you use, or how you follow or interpret CAS disclosure statement if you have one, things like that. Who can sign, who can't sign, etc. So then the company framework, again, is very personal to the company, and it goes up then to governance. So that's where leadership and compliance leaders will set the tone at the top. And that's for employees and personnel responsible for compliance will follow the leader's directions. The tone at the top is incredibly important to a compliant environment because that's where, they're telling you, what's important to them and what's setting the culture of the company. And, they're basically setting the tone at the top to what would it take to be in a compliant environment. So if it's important to them, they're going to pass it all the way down throughout the organization. If it's not important to them, then, the opposite is true. But assuming it's important to them, you'll reach a compliant environment. So the risk in non-compliance, we've listed a couple things here, but these are all things you want to avoid. Withholds, loss of awards, fines and penalties. Obviously suspension or debarment. If you do something really bad, you can get blacklisted. And then the worst case is jail time. I don't think any of us want to spend time in jail. I know that's one of my goals in life, is not to spend any time in jail.
Okay, so now we'll get into our top 10 compliance challenges for government contracting CFOs. And we will start with the FAR and DFARs, which basically includes your cost principles. Oh, perfect timing. We have a polling question. Number 5. I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. And I will move on as you guys finish clicking on your polling question. So with cost principles, you need to demonstrate that your system and your process is set up to allow for the proper cost allocation of allowable costs and of indirect and direct costs, and show that you are segregating unallowable costs. If you fail to do that, they tend to dig in a little more. If you don't have, everybody has some allowable cost. And I like to say, if it's fun, it's not allowable to the government, right? So basically having some segregation of those costs, it shows your intention to do the right thing. And when you don't have that segregated, they tend to dig into other accounts. Like, think about your meals. They may just take a percentage they assume has alcohol included and things like that. And the other thing I would recommend also is just the title of your account. Sometimes what you've labeled them sounds reasonable to you, but the government will look at it and think, oh, we need to dig into that. And then timekeeping. The government looks at labor as it's their largest risk. It's not only the largest cost to the government, but it's also the largest base to allocate your indirects to. So having appropriate labor hour rules and labor distribution, especially on your cost type and T&M projects. Record retention, the FAR mandates basically how you have to maintain your records and for how long, based on different types of records, whether it's labor, whether it's your contracts, and you'll find that in FAR Part 4.7. And lastly, but definitely not least, is oversight of your subcontractors. So to begin with, you need to ensure that you are flowing down the appropriate clauses to your contract. And the CFO will typically work with their contracts person to determine the appropriate clauses that make sense. You don't want to just take everyone from your contract and throw them down on the subcontractor, but you do want to be thorough in ensuring that you have all the appropriate layers, and you're going to need to be sure that they are actually following those cost principles down to the area that they need, and be sure that they are running compliant around all areas of their systems, etc., that we're talking about in these top 10. Cost accounting standards. So depending on your size and the type of your contracts, CAS may apply. There's a whole decision flow chart to determine if you are required to follow CAS. There are many exemptions from that. And one example would be small business. but it's a pretty nice flow chart that you can find, and it will let you know like where you need to pay attention. And then it's just a matter of reviewing your contracts or getting help to do that. That you're running consistently. Any change in your practices need to be disclosed to the government, and letting them know and filling out a new, basically your new CASB statement. And often or potentially, you may need to show the cost impact and how it will impact your contracts and the costs that are going to the government. And that will make a big difference. If it's going to cost the government a lot more money for your changes, then you might have an issue. CAS audits, be prepared for these regular audits. There are a routine number of audits for the various CAS standards. So just assume you will be audited and always be prepared. DCAA audits and reviews, or potentially your cognizant audit agency. Pre-award audits are typically if you are proposing on a cost type contract, the government may do a pre-award audit. You can almost count on it if you are a finalist or if it looks like you're going to be awarded. You may also have a post-award to validate the system is running as described. And that is particularly, of course, for cost type contracts. Your incurred cost submissions. So annually, and this is again on cost type and potentially T&M also. And also there's times you might have a fixed price contract with a cost type CLIN. We have found many of these where the rules were not being followed, and they had the allowable cost and payment clause in that contract. And I don't know, 5-10 years later, we're having to help them go back and prepare incurred cost submissions for each year. They were not following that rule. Labor and timekeeping audits. You might see a floor check. They may show up at your door, or often these days with so much remote, they're showing up, and you might get basically get warned, but you're not supposed to notify your employees that they're coming. But basically running your internal controls and timesheet accuracy, that you're putting your time in daily, you're not putting your time in ahead if you're on a system that doesn't control that. It's very important. Again, like I said in the beginning, labor is the biggest risk to the government. Following your internal controls, and CFOs are expected to maintain rigorous controls, documented processes, and pure evidence for all areas that would be subject to audit. So your documentation is very important. Other types of audits are PBRs, which is your provisional billing rate, that if you have cost type contracts, you'd be submitting something like that, either prior to year end typically. Disclosure statements, CAS audits. They often do voucher reviews or proposal reviews, come out and audit everything. And then there's other specialty audits that might also pop up. Okay, oops, another polling question. Better make sure everybody sees that. We want to get our CPEs. Oops, somehow it took my click to get this off my screen. Back. Well, you got a little preview. There you go. So number 4, we have as your indirect rate structures and your allocations. Have a solid methodology and ensure you're consistent to ensure all of your indirect costs are allocated consistently in accordance with your contractual requirements. So, you have your regular methodology that you've determined for your company, and that should stay consistent. Then you also might have contractual requirements where you have limitations that you'll place on those contracts because you have to follow that level. It's similar to the compliance controls that Brigitte was talking about in the beginning. You may have your overall standard, but then you also have to follow what's in your contract, and that supersedes your other, basically your practices. If you say travel's not allowable and you're traveling, even though travel is allowable in your allocations, you will not be able to allocate it to that particular project. You will have to mark it as unallowable or unbillable. Provisional versus final rates. Understand and manage the implications of your provisional rates versus your final settled rates. Your rate proposals. So submitting and justifying your indirect rate proposals each year for any contracts that have that allowable cost and payment clause. And it's typically going in and showing last year versus your next year that you're proposing. And they're going to look at those variances and percent increases and may have questions around that. And rate variances. Identify and report significant rate variances and the associated impacts. If they look large, you want to do this right away. Update your rates during the year. And it's just as important to update them if they're going up as if they're going down. If they're going down, you do not want to have to owe the government at the end of the year. So you're better off making some changes mid-year if you do not think you're going to make your provisional rates so that you can shift and get yourself back on track for charging the appropriate rates where you think you're going to fall out in the end. Truthful Cost or Pricing Data Act. This is formerly TINA, and if for most of you in government contracting, you will notice most of us will still call it TINA because it had a really nice, I don't know, flow, if you will, an abbreviation. So certifying your costs. CFOs are responsible for the certification and the accuracy of your cost data. When you submit your proposals, you're negotiating, you want to be sure everything is as you know it as of the debt date. You're not going in with anything thinking, we're just going to fudge it a little bit. You need to go in with accurate data. Otherwise, this can lead to defective pricing, which is going to cost adjustments, penalties, or potentially false claims acts. Self-report if you find an issue. That is the best way to move forward. It's always like, if you find something, tell them. Don't hold it. No surprises. And I say this about a lot of things to my people, is no surprises is the best rule. You don't want to have the government find something that you already knew about and could have taken care of in the beginning. In documentation, ensuring you have detailed records and your bases of estimate are all supported with data and detailed documentation of everything that you propose and submit with your proposals.
So number 6 on the list is ethical standards. The main thing around ethical standards is really the training. The CFO should ensure regular training is provided around a number of different things. So ethical conduct, what represents fraud, so people can prevent fraud, and then the whistleblower protection. So really, there's lots of different examples of fraud. And usually this training, starts off with some case or some statistics. And it's usually, I wouldn't say entertaining, if you will, but it's usually got attention grabbing information, because fraud can be perpetrated a number of different ways. And, the training should be about doing what's right in situations that are challenging. Kind of a definition of integrity, doing what's right even when nobody's watching you. So reporting mechanisms, establishing clear channels for reporting suspected fraud or non-compliance. Generally, there should be a hotline poster posted in a well-trafficked area, but there should also be, best practice would say that there's a number that folks can also call internally. So whether it's legal counsel or a compliance board, so that the internal investigations, which is the third item here, that things can happen in an organized fashion. They've got the option, obviously, to call the hotline poster number, but they can also take care of it or start the investigation internally. So internal investigations should be promptly investigated, identified issues, and obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, we've been talking a lot about documentation, but documenting all the steps that are taken, kind of papering the investigation. So, if something were to escalate beyond the internal investigation, you've got everything papered appropriately. And then, of course, we've got the False Claims Act. So there could be severe penalties for submitting fraudulent claims. So something could have happened knowingly or unknowingly, and you could have submitted a fraudulent claim or materially false information. So, the False Claims Act could be a concern for you if there's something done in that regard. And of course, that carries severe penalties if that were to occur. Oh, poll number
We have
7.
another polling question.
Oh, sorry, Tracy.
Get that answered. And then we can move into our next item.
So number 7 is around the socioeconomic program compliance. So this doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. We had CAS on one end. Number 2, I think, was the number for CAS, which is for typically larger businesses. Socioeconomic program compliance is for the smaller businesses. These are the set-aside programs. So it's usually for the small business, hub zone, women-owned, the veteran-owned, like SDVOSB initiatives or that program. So reporting around that, submitting accurate and timely reports on your subcontracting plan and the participation you have in the different programs is paramount here. Maintaining the documentation supporting your eligibility. So around the certifications is key also. So keeping track of that information separately, whether that's in the finance department or accounting department or within contracts if you have a contracts department. Keeping track of that so you're ready and able to submit the reporting or certifications is key. And then back to the flow down clauses again. So you may be the prime on these contracts because of the set aside programs. So you want to ensure that your subcontractors comply with the socioeconomic requirements stipulated in your prime contract. So you flow down the right clauses to them, to your subcontractors, and that they in turn comply with those flow down clauses.
I'm going to pipe in and say one thing also. Many of you, if you keep up with the latest government contracting issues and topics, is a lot of this is changing in this socioeconomic program. So look out for some thought leadership we will be putting out on that so that you can keep up with what's going on.
Number 8 in the challenge list is HR and labor law compliance. So government contractors have a number of additional rules that they need to be cognizant of. The first one here is the Service Contract Act. So this is a special act that is written into certain contracts that deals with different levels or different types of employees. And it allocates a certain wage rate to certain types of employees and also benefits. And so you want to ensure that you're paying them the right wage and you're complying with their benefit requirements. Equal opportunity, that's really adhering to affirmative action and non-discrimination mandates. You want to make sure that what's written in the contract you're complying with. And so it's having a good contracts department, or if not, you're also reading the contract, whoever's in finance, accounting, or that section is read by HR. So they're aware of what's necessary and they're following it. And then employee classification, this is kind of the bread and butter of, HR, maintaining a clear distinction between employees and independent contractors, who's a 1099, who's a W-2 employee. And then I would go a step further and say for the W-2 employees, you also need to be clear around who's exempt from overtime and who's non-exempt. Those classifications are key as well. The Department of Labor website has some really good resources there to help distinguish between the different classifications. And again, documentation, preserving employment records, training certificates, compliance reporting. Some of that comes into play. I should say all that comes into play if you are on the GSA schedule and you have a GSA audit. Education requirements come into play for the different labor categories. And so having the good, clear documentation in the employee records is key. Number 9 here is financial reporting and taxes. I don't feign to be a tax service provider, so I'll touch on taxes. And we don't have much to say about taxes anyhow, but financial reporting, we really get down to the timely and accurate filing and reporting. So having your books audit ready. Audit ready means a number of different things, but it really means that you're ready for a DCAA audit, you're ready for a financial statement audit, you're ready for whenever somebody comes knocking. It could even be a floor check audit, meaning you're keeping your books current, you're in audit ready mode at all times. So you're segregating unallowable costs at the point of entry. You're inspecting and monitoring the contract terms on a regular basis. So even, the contract in the beginning, but also a modification that comes in may not just be increase in funding. It could have some other clause in it. You reconcile your accounts on a routine basis and you close your gap books monthly. Tracy mentioned earlier about a pre-award audit, especially on a cost type contract. There's a number of different elements to that fall in line with some of the things I just mentioned. So segregating unallowable costs, reconciling accounts routinely, and closing your books are 3 of the elements that fall in line with what you need to do on a pre-award audit. And then there's like 9 or 10 other things. Financial statements. Prepare and submit audited financial statements when required by contract terms. So you want to be able, again, to be audit ready so you can go through an audit timely. There's not a lot of adjustments. You don't have a lot of management points. You can get through the audit quickly And you want to keep your books on a GAAP or accrual basis accounting, which is required. From revenue recognition, you want to apply the correct revenue recognition methodologies under the current standards, which is ASC 606. Some folks are still doing the matching principle, revenue and expense are in the same period. They still are thinking it's matching. That's not necessarily the case anymore under ASC 606. So it's knowing what that standard represents and how to calculate revenue or how to recognize revenue at the right time. So if you don't know the standard, then you need to seek some guidance on that from outside counsel. And then tax compliance, monitoring the federal, state, and local tax obligations. It's just something that you want to be aware of. And here, as I mentioned, GAAP or accrual basis is important for financial statements. Cash basis may be okay for tax purposes, but again, I'm not the tax preparer or the tax provider. So you want to check with your tax preparer. And then number 10 is cybersecurity compliance. Steve just went through a whole presentation on CMMC certification, so I'm not going to even attempt to regurgitate any of that. So just reference his presentation on that. The main thing here is incident reporting, establishing protocols for timely reporting and remediation of data breaches. And then you want to have adequate training. So regular cybersecurity training for all employees, especially ones that have access to government data. You want to have a robust training program put in place so folks know what data they're handling, how they need to handle it, what they need to do with it if something happens to the data, what machines they should be working with the data on, and what not to do. And all those things are important in the training program.
So best practices, and the key elements here are have sound internal controls and ensure that you have complete documentation that actually says what you're doing and you're doing what you say. You provide training at a minimum once a year to your employees. Ensure that they're familiar with their timekeeping rules and that they're at risk all the way up to the CFO and the president. Everybody is at risk if even one employee has an issue. And if you find something on one employee, the government will, I've seen this recently, will almost require that you look at everything because they feel like if you're saying one issue, someone's falsifying time or other areas, but that's the biggest, that they will think you may have others. And so you need to tighten up your floor checks that you do internally and be sure that what you're billing is accurate. So providing that training to employees and being able to basically prove that you've done this training is important. Your manuals on ethics and timekeeping and expense reporting and many other things should have some training at least yearly as reminders. You're responsible for reporting and your certifications, being audit ready. So always having your books in order, always having your documentation. You don't want to be caught off guard. Stay consistent. ensure everything that you're doing is consistent from a cost perspective, your allocations are consistent, and that you're handling like costs in the same way. And stay current with your rules and regulations, and ensure that you're always keeping up or using consulting or some other mechanism to make it easy on you to keep up with the latest. And Brigitte, I don't know if you have anything to add here. It's unusual that we don't have any questions. So we've allowed time for questions. Speaking of questions, here's a polling question, number 8. And I think I saw that we're leaving these up now for a minute, so you have a chance to, be sure that you're getting them, that you're seeing them, and that you can respond. And we got to get those CPEs.
Does anybody want to pose any other challenges that they've encountered, even in the questions or comments?
Yeah, if you put it in the Q&A, we could speak to it. Oh, okay.
We'd be happy
Sure,
to
Cindy.
send the link for the cast decision
Yeah,
tree.
happy to. We can include it with the slides. Absolutely.
It used to be in the information for contractors. They rewrote that. Anticipate any changes to certified payroll requirements?
Oh, great question.
That is a great question.
You might have stumped us on that one.
Oh, that's anonymous. We can't even get back to you. On the last slide, I think we have our email. Perhaps you want to send an email to us directly. That way we can respond to you.
Yes. Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate that. Feel like there has to be questions. Oh,
can we go over
Gita,
CAS
do you
606
want to just
example?
or
Well,
maybe
that might
just
take
mention
an hour.
Yeah, I know. Maybe you could just mention a few. You're definitely more familiar than I am, but just maybe some of the changes from the way things used to be.
So there's 5 different steps that you go through now. The main thing is the first step is there needs to be evidence of the contract. So it's not that you just can have a handshake or a like an idea of an agreement. There needs to be a contract. And then the last step is that you basically have transfer control to the customer. And in between, I don't want to get the steps out of order. I don't have my notes right in front of me. Actually, I probably do.
Yeah. Oh,
Well,
and
I won't get there's you identify the different elements of the contract, you identify the different pricing, and there's certain ways you do that to the different elements of the contract, and then you allocate the cost or the price among the different elements of the contract. But then the first step is paramount. There needs to be a contract, and the last step is paramount, that you need to transfer control.
Yeah. Sorry. I was going to open up also if they had CMMC questions. And
Dolores, I can send, I'm happy to send you some guidance
Joe, great question. So the shutdown is affecting clients very differently. Some of our clients aren't affected at all. And some of them are, if they are working in an essential area of the government, they are continuing to work from what I'm seeing at this moment. And others are not allowed to work, and we're trying to help them figure all that out and be sure, especially if they have fixed price contracts, figure out if, request that they get makeup time so they don't lose anything there and that they can actually finish their requirements. Because I think most of us are expecting, we've put out some thought leadership, by the way, everybody. We are expecting the shutdown, just, from what we're seeing, to continue for several weeks. Both sides are digging in, and neither side really wants to give in because of midterms. So we do feel like they're going to be holding tight at least for 3 to 4 weeks. Now, if we go back to work tomorrow, that will be great, and I'll be happy to be wrong. How often does DCAA audit small companies? That is just, it depends, our favorite answer, but totally depends. It depends on your type of contracts. It depends on, like if you have cost type, lots of different reasons. So everything we talked about today, except for CAS, is open for audit. And Brigida, you look like you might want to say something else.
I was gonna say, it depends on what type of contracts you have now or what you're bidding on.
Yeah, that's true. Contract A&F department maintain a professional training log. A training log, I mean, anything documented is never a bad idea. So I haven't seen that actually required, but having something that shows that they've been trained would be fantastic. Happy to share a link with thought leadership, and maybe our folks can help with that. We have quite a bit. Let's see here. Oh, webinar chat, since you can't see the questions. Oh, I
Did you
apologize.
Did you
So
see Chuck Kennedy's?
yes, but I was answering, I'm also monitoring the chat because I didn't realize, I'm not even thinking they couldn't see the questions. So we were asked to share a link for the thought leadership. And then now we're being asked, can contractors expect to receive timely government payments if the shutdown continues? That always varies as well. The last shutdown, we definitely saw some delays in payments. I always hope that they'll think of that and make those folks essential, but they rely on so many other areas of the government that I'm not sure. And I don't know, Brigida, have you seen other things?
Well,
Okay.
I think your point's well taken. They rely on other areas of the government to process the payments. So if they don't make DFAS essential, then
Yeah.
and that's just for defense. But
Yeah.
also DFAS processes other payments.
So another question that we have is, can we discount our G&A rate burdened on ODCs? You sure can, and you're often asked to do that. If there's good reason, you don't want to do it just because, but if you feel like you need to do that, that is fine.
I don't even see that question.
Let's see, for a new contractor, should we expect to be audited? Or does this depend on the size of the contract and risk assessment by the government? It definitely, I think we probably answered this a little bit, but it's not the size of the contract. It's more about the type of the contract and clauses in there. Is it a cost type, and things like that? back to also defective pricing, if you certified, a lot of things that depends on. Happy to answer that if you want to reach out to us. And
There's
no
one about
training.
sending DCAA auditors to your home.
Yeah. Also there was, yeah, do you know of any training courses for staff new to government contracting? I mean, there's a lot on DCA's website. We also provide training, and there's probably lots to be found out there. I have not seen DCA send anybody to their home unless it's a registered office. Then I have, if that's where the records are kept. I've seen that happen, but I've not seen them just show up at your door. I don't know, Brigida, if you've seen something
No, I've
different.
never seen that or heard of that.
Okay. What are the rules for employees working in other countries remotely, assuming they are authorized to work in the US, but might be temporarily in another country? That's going to depend also on your contracts and your rules. And Steve might also even have input there. But we have strict rules for our employees working on our government contracting clients. Is we don't allow a lot of it, and it definitely depends where they are.
Yeah, I think Tracy, from a CMMC perspective, it goes back into prescribed boundaries and understanding the flow of CUI, and whether or not those mobile devices are operating through a VPN and considered in scope, or whether they're actually executing through a VDI to keep those laptops out of scope. There's a broader implication just on certain geographic locations that are high-risk locations that certainly should be considered above and beyond CMMC, and just making sure that there are additional safeguards there as far as how you're protecting the equipment and such. But as it comes to so the CMMC rules and implications, just making sure you're defining your system security plan, how those mobile devices are operating, how they're classified, the type of classification, the right safeguards that you have on the endpoint units, the type of data that you're accessing. Obviously, there's no foreign CUI, could be bigger considerations, as opposed to regular CUI that may not be restricted is in international areas, as long as you are adhering to the CMMC safeguards. That's basic CUI. It's really the no foreign CUI that brings the burden up to a different level. But again, I would just make sure that you're understanding the responsibilities of the contractors and or employees that are operating the mobile devices, a broader security perspective of making sure that the safeguards are in place, and then tying that back to your system security plan in the asset classification and making sure that you're handling that appropriately.
Thank you, Steve. Well, I'm really glad that we actually had this extra time, because it sparked some really good conversation. I believe we will be turning this back over to Grant.
Leah.
Or Leah, sorry about that. That's right. I'm sorry about that.
Yes, so Grant had to step away, but I'm happy to step in and close things out. Eunice, if you want to go to the next slide. Oh, we also have some, materials. We'll share these slides with you, so you have links to everything that Tracy and Brigida shared during their presentation. So we just wanted to close things out by saying this has been a great learning event, and we really appreciate you spending your morning with us. Before we wrap up, I would first like to thank Tracy Sheps, Steve Ursulo, and Brigida Scott for this great and interesting learning experience for all of us. I also want to acknowledge there was a bit of confusion around the CPE polling today. If you've experienced any issues or are unsure whether your responses were recorded, please reach out to us at Cherry Beckert Learning at cbhlearning@cbh.com. You can also find my contact information, Leah Gearhart, in the event invitation. So please reach out to one of us and we can direct you to the right place. Our next event will be the Virginia Ethics with Jennifer Lewis. She's a talented trainer with over 30 years of experience as a professional instructor from the AICPA's Business Learning Institute. And I'm sure you'll find Jennifer to be very knowledgeable and quite entertaining as well. So next slide. And finally, we would like to thank all of our sponsors, especially Cherry Becker, for their great program today. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you again next Thursday morning.